Hello, Global Theater. My name is Jerry Fielka. Today is May 31, 2024. We want to thank Rob Grant and his amazing podcast. I'm probably wrong about everything. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here today with Jacob Michael King. Where in the heck you calling in from, Jacob?
I'm calling from sunny Tulsa, Oklahoma. It's actually raining or about to rain here right now. And that's my cat, Sadie.
All right. First question is, what is the best thing for a human being?
I mean, I would have to say theosis. I mean, it's interesting, right? Because I was talking to someone yesterday who's a psychologist, and she was a really thoughtful person. But there's this idea of diagnosis in psychology, that it's like something becomes a problem. I'm going to get the wording on this a little bit wrong, but basically, like if it impairs your functioning in everyday life, and it's interesting because this idea of being a member integrated into society is a really the way that we understand that now is a pretty recent innovation, right? Like the ambition of the spiritual life, at least for centuries, right, was to literally become united with God. And so, like, if a human being is fully alive in being united with God, I would imagine that would be the best thing. It's not like I am at all an exemplar of that, but it's like a lot of people that are a lot smarter than me seem to have held that as the highest value. And at a risk of appealing to authority, or I suppose that's an authority worth appealing to, despite it may be a logical fallacy. I don't know. I'm sorry if that's a horribly pretentious answer for you.
No, don't worry. This is what I want. I want tangents, stories, anecdotes. Okay. It's me and you versus the wording on the question. So yeah, I'm open for it all. It was really beautiful. Thank you. I thought that was deep what you just said. And the second question is, what's your favorite form of information? How it comes into you?
That's a really thoughtful. I don't. So you know what? In humility, like I would say, I wish I read more. Like I've been working on this script for the last few months, and so almost everything has been film or YouTube videos, etc. It's interesting. I know that you're very conversant with McLuhan, Jerry. And are you familiar with his essay, "The Invisible Environment"?
Not that one specifically. Tell me about it.
He wrote this, I think he might have written it in the 50s, but as you know, like McLuhan feels more relevant today than ever. And he had this idea that like part of the reason kids are bored in school is because what we're trying to do is to get them to read. And we're no longer in a visual society anymore. We now live in an auditory society, right? And so, like as things collapse and become decentralized, and we begin to inhabit this global village idea, like auditory forms of communication are going to be a lot more emphasized. And it's interesting to me because I feel like a lot of times I do learn better at times by listening to a podcast or by watching a YouTube video or watching a film. That being said, it's interesting because I think if you sit with a book for a while and like let that way of assimilating information sort of sink into you, like you get acclimated to its rhythm. But it's just interesting because like the pace of the world right now seems to discourage it. I don't know. Have you found that to be the case? What is your favorite way of assimilating information? Can I ask you? Can I turn that back?
No, I mean, listen. Most people I ask, 68% will kind of go direct experience and reading. I mean, reading is the highest one because I do interview a lot of intellects who've learned mainly from reading, but they've learned from all five senses. I mean, the favorite way of the best answer ever, Jacob, was Norman Klein. Check out his books, History of Forgetting. I says, what's your favorite form of information? He went, honest.
I see.
So he shifted what is implied to be a noun or a verb answer to an adjective. So you see, that's what I'm about is we're just playing with this is like a playground with language. So, I mean, basically, let's go back to books and reading first. Before I do that is neuroscientists say sight is the most dominant sense.
Yeah.
So when you go, wow, well, kids, whatever people are doing now, they're sitting there texting all day, and every video has, not every, a lot of videos have text. So you're reading and what it's visual, and so it's a complex question, and it's like one of McLuhan's great uh students said, simplex. It's simple and it's complex. It's like it's a snake eating its tail. It's a Mobius strip. It's forever. There's no right or wrong answer. But when you say reading, let's just go into that. Did you become a reader, one, because your parents told you to, two, they did it as an example, or three, on your own?
Yes. Is like my simple answer, but it's interesting because from the time I was pretty young, I wanted to be, both a writer and a filmmaker. And um, something happened to me where I always had trouble reading fiction. And one of my favorite fiction writers is William H. Gass. I don't know if
Yeah.
you're familiar with him, but
Yeah.
he noted that he really couldn't read novels as easily as like biography and philosophy. Like that's what he liked to read. And it was interesting because I never really read nonfiction until I started to get older. And it's like I find something like theology or history or books on religion, et cetera, like way more interesting than the average novel, even by a great novelist. Like the novelists that I really enjoy, which might say something about my fiction, are like the more experimental types, like Gass, or like I'm a big fan of John Hawkes. If your viewers are familiar with him, I think he's marvelous. Very underrated, sort of forgotten right now. Hopefully only temporarily, but like for me, it's interesting because I became a more voracious reader when I discovered philosophy, or when I discovered like someone like Plato, or right now I'm reading uh, Waite's book on occultism, right? And which I'm a Catholic convert, so I'm not like a big fan of the occult, but I've definitely studied it pretty extensively. And it's that to me, I read half of that book in a couple of hours because it was like catnip to me, versus if I try to get through even a great novel, a lot of times it's fits and starts for me. It's a really strange thing, but it's like novels are just I have been reading Bram Stoker's Jewel of the Seven Stars for months at this point because
Yeah.
I can't bother to pick it up. There's always something more interesting to look at.
Well, why do you think humans collect or gather information?
I mean, simplest answers. I think it's our way of making sense of the world. I think it's our way of making sense of the world, but it's like it's the only way for us to communicate with other people as well.
Yeah.
And so, Jerry, I would challenge you. I'd really like to hear your perspective on this, on what you noted about text on video. Is I would argue that the average YouTube video, the text is actually a supplement, or it's like almost like a garnish on the main dish, which is auditory. It's so interesting, like the popularity of someone like, I don't know, Joe Rogan, for example, right? Where he has all of these scientists or whatever on his podcast. I think part of the reason that that's become interesting to people is because we've returned, like McLuhan talks about, to this experience of people sitting around a bonfire instead of the sort of the lecturer, even, or the which is auditory in a sense, but there's like instead of reading books or memorizing by rote, which is wholly visual. And also I think McLuhan would classify text as a hot medium. I may be wrong,
Yeah,
but
well,
um,
yeah,
but I may be wrong. But yeah, it does seem like the auditory, like radio, is a colder medium, right? The phone is a colder medium.
yeah.
Um,
Well, yeah, I'm not well versed in hot and cold. I know what McLuhan was trying to get at, and it's just one part of Marshall I haven't delved into. But what you're talking about is sense ratio shifting. When you
yeah,
read a book, your visual is a little more dominant.
yeah,
When you read Finnegan's Wake out loud with a group of people, you shift a visual experience into an auditory experience, but you still have to be looking at
Yep.
the text. So that's a little complex. But to make sense of the world, that was a good answer. That's why do we collect information? Most people say survival, make sense of the world. Okay. But one thing I wanted to update you on is, mid-career Marshall, it's kind of abandoned Global Village and changed it to Global Theater. He's
Really?
basically 1940 to 1980, he writes 22 books. In the 60s, he gets his picture on the cover of Newsweek as the guru of TV, and he's a literature guy,
Mhm.
and he shifts it to the global theater, which is really what, when talk radio takes over, it's no longer a one-way medium. Joe Rogan is talk radio. Joe Rogan is not talk radio. Joe Rogan is a one-way medium.
Yeah.
It's coming into you. But, coast to coast or whatever, the most listened to radio show in the world, that's two-way. That's two-way. You're hearing information from the radio and people are calling up and adding to it. So that's where the comments section in the videos in
Yes.
YouTube videos becomes, it's a two-way medium. In the past, the newspaper would have letters to the editor, but they were well curated. Oh, we didn't put, now you can have many, many comments.
I know all about it.
Yeah, and so this is like more all the stages of theater. It's Marshall's big thing when Sputnik went up, the world became a stage, and it's the new sphere by via Tehil Chardin, and then we all became actors in the global theater,
Right.
and so that's what we are, whether we're voting or not voting, whether we're doing Facebook or not doing Facebook, we live in a Facebook world. So the next question is this need or want to collect information more innate or more invented by humans?
Oh, I think it's innate.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting, right? Like, I don't know if are you familiar at all with the Gospel of John?
No, tell me.
Okay, so in the opening of the Gospel of John, right? It opens with, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." And now
Yeah.
that word used, right, is logos.
Yeah.
And so a lot of people see that as John is evoking two things, right? First of all, he's invoking the Platonic logos, you
Yeah.
know, and this sort of Platonic realm of ideas. But then also he's evoking the first words of Genesis, and the language in Greek is the same. There's this phrase in arche, and there's no article before arche. And typically, as far as I know, my Greek is terrible, but as far as I know, typically there is an article. But in both the Septuagint, which is the oldest form of the Jewish scripture we have, which is in Greek, and in the Gospel of John, you have this phrase in arche. So it's clearly a reference, right? And so this is when God spoke, right? When God spoke and made, let there be light, etc. So when God called the world into existence from an idea, sort of like the Egyptian concept that, Thoth is the mind of God, right?
Yeah.
Is this messenger of God. And so like Christ being co-equal with the Father. So it's different from Thoth in that sense, but like Christ being co-equal, but he's also the word through which God spoke and, formed the cosmos. It's interesting because like if we're made in that image, right, and if that is so, like our capacity to collect information is imperfect and it ultimately corrodes us, right? Like it can drive us nuts. It can do all kinds of things. But if the word becomes flesh and dwells among us, as the Gospel of John says, like the idea is that our broken state, it's like the broken physical matter eventually will actually be raised up to a divine state. Like the world of the formal and the material world are forever separated in Platonism, right? And in traditional Christianity, at least, like what part of what drew me to it, what I found so fascinating is there's this astonishing, audacious idea, right? The phrase among theologians is the scandal of the incarnation. There's a scandalous idea that the formal world actually became material, that the Lord of the formal world became material to raise the material world up to the same immortal perfection that the formal world, that attains in the formal world. You understand?
Yeah.
And so it's interesting because traditionally, like a priest would pray with his back to the congregation, and he would be facing east toward the rising sun, because what he was offering God to God for the redemption of all creation, as a prayer to like heal and mend the brokenness of matter, which evokes Benjamin, like that,
Yeah.
that every moment is the straight gate through which the Messiah might enter. If that makes sense. But I
Well,
promise I don't have a pamphlet for you or anything.
yeah.
Just,
No, that was good, Jacob, and he really evoked. Frank Zappa wrote a song called "Dumb All Over," and he says, "If we're made in God's likeness
Mhm.
and we're godlike, then and we're dumb, then God must be dumb and a little ugly on the side." So he's a satirist, but it
Sure.
is evoking this. Um, Many questions that we're coming up to. So that was really deep what you said, and I appreciate it. Do thoughts create emotions?
So it's weird because that's like an epistemological question. And I feel like I'm being such a dork here, but there is like an epistemological element there, right? And it's like, I don't know how my epistemology is, I would say not formed that well, but it's interesting to me because are you familiar with this idea of a phantasm? It's used a lot in magic, like not like sleight of hand magic, but like ritual magic. Are you familiar with this?
Tell me about it. Go ahead.
Um, so it's in Aristotle and in Aquinas this idea that there is no thought without a phantasm, and a phantasm is this kind of like image that comes into us from the outside, right? Like I'm not actually seeing the computer. I'm seeing this light image inside my head of a
Yeah.
representation of the computer. But all kinds of phantasms can enter. It's not just physical matter, the outside world, that can be a phantasm that enters us.
Yeah.
And so all the time, it's like, if you're thinking of the cheeseburger you're going to have after the interview or whatever, you have an image of that.
Yeah.
And you have an image of yourself eating it, and then there's an emotional and a physical component to that phantasm, right? Like it draws the soul toward it, and there's an idea in I believe it's in Aquinas, but it's also in sort of in magical texts as well. The idea that someone can send a phantasm, or that a demon or an angel could send a phantasm to you, right? Like
Yeah.
you get a phantasm and you're inspired to sin, or you're inspired to do something bad or something good. And so it's interesting to me because like I don't know the answer to that question, like
Yeah.
in general, but I do think that there is a connection. I think the soul can be drawn in certain directions. Like I think we one of the best examples and the easiest, I think, almost like universally people have experienced this is like anger, right? Like surely there have been times when you've been angry and you're like about to lose your temper, and your soul is being drawn to that, and you say, hey, hold on a minute, right? Like I'm not going to obey this side of myself, and then that side quiets, right? Like the soul moves away from that, moves away from indulging that. And so,
Well,
yeah,
it's a really good example. Yeah, and the thing is some of these are either or at the beginning, and of course it's both, and it depends. Fill in the blank, Jacob. I don't know what I think until I.
can I just delete half of that and just say I don't know what I think?
Of
I mean,
course.
yeah, I mean,
That's
honestly, I'm suspicious of my own biases, and I'm suspicious of my own. Um,
Yeah.
are you familiar with the streamer Destiny?
No, I'm not. Streamer,
Yeah,
STREAM.
he like played video games for a while. He was like a League of Legends Twitch streamer, but then he's a sharp guy and he got into politics, and he's a pretty thoughtful dude. He's sort of like a moderate, like, and I not to be political at all, but what I find interesting about him, I often disagree with him. I often agree with him, but he comes to his ideas, I think, pretty thoughtfully often. And one thing that he said that I think is very true, is that people are convinced that they make rational decisions, but almost always that's not the case, right? Like they have these inbuilt prejudices. I'm probably misrepresenting what he said a little bit, but I feel too that people have these sort of like inbuilt prejudices that
Yeah.
are subconscious almost, and then the reasoning comes up later.
Yeah,
Um,
this is hold on. This is really good because this is a bumper sticker on a car on my street. It says, "Don't believe everything you think."
yeah,
And I go, well, you could say, don't believe everything you feel. So you
yeah,
can't separate feeling from thought, but we think we can because we invented the words. But let's go to the follow up. You'll see everything comes full circle. Is McLuhan says, I don't know what I think until I say it. Joan Didion says, I don't know what I think until I write it. So a lot of people say, I don't know what I think until I experience it or do it or think about it or whatever. I mean, V. Bale said it best. He goes, or anyways, there's many answers to it. But see, that's what I'm after is more your like you have to be honest and lay your cards on the table. I can't answer that or I don't know is completely welcomed here.
okay,
You don't
great.
have to answer the question. These are just prompts. And then it's me and you versus the wording. So for you, I've been waiting for someone to say that. I don't know what I think. Could I just stop it there? Period. That's
Yeah,
fine. So can humans think without language?
I don't think humans can think without phantasms.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I don't know. I don't because that's another thing. Is like, what do we mean when we say language?
Yeah.
You know. Um, so I, in the beginning was the word, right? And I think that there's more to that than just this literalistic reading of word, obviously.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't.
Okay, well, here's let's just keep going, Jacob, because like I said, things will come full circle. This is Chomsky. A language is not just words. It's a
Mhm,
culture, a tradition, a unification of community, a whole history that creates what a community is.
mhm.
What do you do when language doesn't work? When language breaks down, what do you do?
You pray. I think it's. I mean, I think that it's interesting because I think like a lot of the division that's present politically or culturally right now, because I lived in California for 13 years, right? So I've had like an interesting experience because like moving back to Oklahoma, it's more, I guess, like culturally conservative, and California is seen as like more culturally free. I'm not entirely comfortable with either of those labels or assessments, but that's sort of like the general consensus, the way people think of both places. But it's interesting to me because I think a lot of these cultural divides right now were latent in our sort of way of speaking to one another. And I think that the way that we use language, a lot of times it's like we just have radically different definitions of things.
Yeah.
And
That's a great McLuhan line. Shut up, he said.
yeah,
That's funny,
yeah.
but it is form and content. That's really what we're talking about. All the major McLuhan probes, causality, form and content, effects precede causes, sense ratio shifting. Here's the same. We've already reviewed this, but I'm going to ask it anyways. Your observations of humans in general, are we more feeling beings or more thinking beings?
I think we're suffering beings.
Wow.
And
See,
and I know
welcome the new word. Yeah, the new word is needing. We're suffering
yeah,
being.
or even to take from Kierkegaard, we're despairing beings.
Yeah,
And there has to be a means of resolving that despair.
yeah,
Uh, there's a beautiful passage from Sickness Unto Death about that, which I won't butcher because I don't remember it. But essentially, yeah, I mean, I think that in a lot of people, their despair is not they've suppressed it so effectively
Yeah.
that in general they don't observe it. But yeah, I mean, I think that we're beings in need of help.
Yeah. Okay. Here's two questions from Alan Turing in the 50s. One, is thinking a function of the soul?
Yes.
The second Turing is, can machines think?
I don't know. I don't know enough about machines. And because like when we talk about like reasoning, right, or deducing or inducing, right,
Yeah.
like those sorts of things, like is that what we mean by think, right, or
Yeah.
are we talking about this weird process that's really not visible to us? That does it begin with thinking? Does it begin with feeling? And this experience of like coming to a conclusion, which there are a million different things happening to us when that actually occurs. Even though it may happen in an instant, we believe, we don't realize that when we were 6 and stubbed our toe, that was like the beginning of the reason that we chose to vote this way or that, or we like this person, we don't like that person, or whatever.
Yeah.
But that process, I don't know whether or not a machine can be that.
Yeah. This is reminding me of Brigitte Bardot also, who said, when I make love, I don't think. And it's like, good luck. How can you turn your brain off? Like people who meditate, they go, okay, think about not thinking. So again, I'm going for your impulse, your intuition, your hunch, your guess, as well as, your well thought out background in referencing so much important literature and things you've learned. I appreciate this. It's really good, Jacob. I appreciate your time here.
Oh,
Do
thank you.
you do you more pursue happiness or more pursue meaning?
Meaning.
Yeah.
Or I guess what I would say is, I would say like meaning pursues me. Like I think there's
Yeah.
I think in general, I think most people, like I hope most people are this way. Otherwise, then I'm like worse than everybody else. But it's like, I'm always battling my own laziness, and I'm always battling my own sort of tendency toward what is that? Is it entropy? Like Freud in his last book, that crazy last book about the death drive. Damn, I'm sorry. You know the book I'm talking about.
No, I don't, but it's all right. But
But
what does he say basically?
his idea is that like that it's like quasi mystical. This is like a really weird final book for Freud, and it's like not totally coherent. It's a very, very weird book. It reads like he's zonked out on coke or something. But basically that like everything actually sort of races towards stasis, and that everything is kind of like dissolving, and the act of living or like pushing through to like remain an animated being actually takes a degree of effort that there's a part of us that just kind of wants to give up, right? And there's a part of me that does just kind of want to sit on a couch and let barnacles like slowly cover me. But I know that that's wrong, and so like in
But
my
it
best
isn't.
moments.
But that's where I would disagree. It's not that it's wrong. You have a value system, but having slack,
Hmm.
being relaxed, and not going full blast all the time is a necessary part of being human. So that's where it's McLuhan's, one of his most important things is suspended judgment. Understanding is not having a point of view. So understanding laziness is not saying, oh, it's good or bad. It's, well, there's a time for me to be lazy, and maybe I'll call it relaxing or napping.
Yeah.
You want to make a value judgment because like I'm gonna go getter and I've got to work and have be productive. But that is we're going to get into that whole Eastern philosophy thing, is be here now, be in the moment. So what's faster, speed of light or speed of thought?
I don't know, but speed of light seems pretty fast. But I have a question for you. I would just like to hear your thoughts on it, just because you're so conversant with McLuhan. So McLuhan has this idea, I'm sure you know, that like every new major medium like swallows up the old mediums, right?
Yeah,
Like cinema swallows theater, television swallows
yeah,
cinema. And then, you know, he predicts the internet, right? With this medium that's an extension of the central nervous system
yeah,
itself. And something that like struck me because I got into video games a few years ago is I realized like video games actually swallow up the internet in the sense that like they incorporate the internet, but video
yeah,
games swallow up cinema, they swallow up music, right?
yeah.
Like every other medium, text, absolutely. Like there is some beautifully written prose in
But
good
again,
games.
it's two way. The video game is two way. TV was one way
Yeah.
basically until it got on YouTube. Cinema is one way. So that's where there is a differentiation. And of course, it's like that's the car is a good example. When the horse and buggy was replaced by the car, then the horse and buggy became an art form.
Yes.
So then people use it to have a romantic ride through Central Park. But you know, there's variations on it. But what was your question? Was there a question there or
Yeah, I just sort of wanted to hear your thoughts on like I don't know if you, it's interesting because some video games I mean they're two way in the sense that you interact with them, but like some video games actually like talk radio is swallowed up as well because you know there's like a host and you can be talking to them and you know
yeah,
a zillion people can be watching you, or there are other video games that are single player experiences. You know,
yeah,
like entirely, you know, a game like The Surge, I don't know, which is a masterpiece, but it's like
yeah,
it's a game that's just crushingly difficult and it's not online and it's something that you really spend hours of your time mastering.
yeah.
And I just wonder what someone like you would think if you know like if I sat you in front of The Surge. Uh,
I never really played video games. And I mean, have you watched Adam Curtis's films?
I saw part of Century of the Self, but
Yeah,
I
good,
haven't
good. You
seen.
should, because he has that footage of the first Pong game
Mm,
being shown to a group of people in an auditorium, and they all have a joystick on their lap. And it's sort of like, oh, and they're all doing it. So they're in a live room. It's sort of the flip is, I mean, I have thoughts about video games, and it's an important medium. They said, oh, when video games they were healthy for kids because only two kids could play one video game at once, so the third one would go outside and play until their turn was up.
yeah,
But it's like, you know, it has become a huge art form because you look at the New York Times in the calendar section or the arts and entertainment section has reviews of books, movies, TVs, and video games are on that same level.
yeah,
Now, I saw David O'Reilly speak at the Ann Arbor Film Festival, and he invented he's a big hotshot video game designer, and he invented this video game called Mountain, which is just this mountain floating in space, and it's just that's all it is. So it's like sort of different kind of video game. And he says fuck storytelling, it's all about empathy. So he went that well, what is the route I'm luring my user into my medium with is feeling. But you know, video game is making you more what do they call that, you know, dex you know, you respond faster. You know what TSA is, tactile situation awareness. It's a good example to answer your question. You know, have you ever heard of it? TSA. Okay.
I think I've heard of it, but
Okay,
it
here it
was.
is. Here it is. The bomber pilot, the army dude's in the plane, and he gets hit. He can't study all the gauges and do all the prep so he won't die in that moment. He has to act immediately
Yeah.
on intuition, and he can't identify with a gauge
Mhm.
or what he's learned in the past. That's what kids raised on video games and the internet and cell phones and apps and social media are. They don't identify with just Instagram. They identify with Facebook, Instagram, cell phones, email, spoken word, printed word, everything. And so that they're wider and they're more comprehensive and they're not identifying with one medium. Is that good or bad? No, it's just has services and disservices. I mean, essentially. But let's move on, because what will happen is we will come back and you can continue to bring up things. This is, and it's about tools. Audre Lorde is a poet. She said, you can't dismantle the master's house using the master's tools. Her colleague, Yvonne Rainer, responded and said, you can if you expose the tools. What new tool do you suggest?
I would suggest a tool. I'm suspicious of someone that wants to dismantle the master's house.
Right.
And what? Sorry.
No, I understand.
Okay. Yeah. So,
I just said right. Yeah.
And in part because, so I'm definitely not I'm not a fan of like the neocon worldview, but I also think I think that to go back to McLuhan, I feel like he's the theme. He's like the ghost in this room among us. But I was actually reading today in preparation for this interview that chapter in Understanding Media about how about like the great reversals, right? Like the kind of like political and spiritual and social reversals that inevitably happen in every civilization. Right. And it's interesting because like in the 60s and 70s, especially, there was this the establishment was seen as, or like the military industrial complex was like really identified with the American right, like much more so than with the American left. And so like the people that would vote or like the hippie movement, et cetera, like identified with the left and were sympathetic to sort of a lot of them, like Marxist ideas, et cetera, like a lot of the public intellectuals. And it's interesting because now to be most of the people that are like to be punk rock, if you've ever seen some of like the modern punk rock that's become a hit, it's all like neoliberal garbage and like identity politics nonsense. A lot of it, right? Whereas like it does seem like the right.
Oh, wait, explain that for a second. You mean it's like Nazi punks, or it's like Fugazi saying we won't sell our ads for our punk rock and magazines that sell cigarette ads, and we'll keep our ticket price down to $5. I mean, I'm not sure what you're saying, because I think there's a variety of punk movements. I mean, these punks beat up Jello Biafra in a club once in San Francisco, saying, you own a house, that's not punk.
Right.
So, I mean, that's like, okay, Jello's always been political. He made enough money to buy a house. Don't beat him up, but they think that's not punk. So, the other one is Malcolm McLaren's son, when Malcolm, who just, helped market the Sex Pistols, when he died, his son took all his memorabilia and put it on a barge and burned it in the middle of the Thames River. Now, a lot of people went, that's so punk rock. And then some people go, that's stupid. The fucking shit will burn and pollute the earth. And he should have sold it all and fed the homeless or did something that was true. So, but I did appreciate that he did it as an act to kind of evoke his dad's spirit of punk rock, even though his dad ran a fucking boutique and said, here, you angry factory kids, stick a safety pin in your ear and I'll make you a rock star.
It's interesting. So I think there's a lot to say about that. What that story actually reminds me of. Have you ever read Suzuki's book on Zen Buddhism called Zen Buddhism?
No, that's Alan Watts' teacher.
I don't know if it's on.
Yeah,
That's
Dean Suzuki. What's his name?
DT Suzuki.
DT Suzuki. Yeah, on Zen. Go ahead. What are you going to say?
Yeah, but it might be called on Zen. But there are all these like Zen stories, sprinkled throughout it. And there's this one where it's like, so when this one Zen master was about to die, like he's supposed to appoint his successor, right? And so he's sitting with his disciple in front of this fire, and he has these manuscripts. And he says like something to the effect of like, there are 9 generations of Zen masters, and this is all of their thought. Like, this is the only copy. This is the greatest treasure of all Zen Buddhism, and I want to present it to you because it was entrusted to me. And his student takes all the manuscripts and throws them in the fire. And the master says, "What are you doing?" And the student says, "What are you saying?" Right? Because it's not Zen to have, it's like Zen, if it's not in you, then it won't do it. Then otherwise it's the finger pointing of the moon, right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, what I'm talking about is more like, the Rage Against the Machine guy, which sort of like, I think the Rage Against the Machine guy like supported Obama, right? And it's like, that's not very punk, right? Like a guy that kills American citizens without trial, that like prosecutes more journalists, that's deported more immigrants than all other presidents.
Yeah, but in general, Obama's a lefty. So I understand. Fucking Biden's a war criminal, but it's like, anyways, there is this division that's widespread and not definable, but it's basically right or lefty. And so we use these categories to help us move forward, but in a lot of ways they make us move backwards. So that's who's the great philosopher who said we live our lives walking forward, but in order to understand them, you got to go backwards. So what you're talking about is the tetrad, one of Marshall's major things. In the 4th step of the tetrad is the question, what does it become when pressed to an extreme? Mm-hmm. So if you take a car and press it to an extreme, what does it become? A traffic jam. Okay, that's a disservice. What does it become when pressed to an extreme? A service, a home. I have friends who live in Venice, California, and they live in their cars. They don't have to vacuum clean. They don't have to pay rent. Okay, so that could be considered a service. But for the person who's the car's in front of their house all the time, they might not like that. So it's all about the context, the environment that it creates. So I think our initial thing was punk rock and politics is a huge subject, and it has services and disservices. Yeah. Both religion and punk rock has services and disservices. Yeah.
So, but I guess my argument would be that I think the right in some ways has actually become more punk rock than the left. In the age of, like, I think Alex Jones is a lot more punk rock than Rachel Maddow, right? Like because Alex Jones is treated in a way like
he was. That's why Richard Linklater put him in his films. Now he's like, okay, let's get real here. I mean, Rachel, I never really watched her, listened to her, but I watched her for a couple minutes last night, and she really talked and sussed out the convicted criminal scenario well. So, again, this is always in flux. These things are always in flux. I understand what you're saying, that punk rock, it's the irony of punk rock, and it's only someone like Zappa who said he was for the freaks in LA. That's what became hippies. And then he made fun of the hippies. He was the only person making, well, they're a Madison Avenue marketing scheme to sell blue jeans in Fringe. Mm-hmm. And he cut down the hippies. It doesn't mean he was flipping his political sort of beliefs. He was just being a satirist. So there's a lot to go on there. I mean, to get to the root of the question is Audre Lorde is probably saying the master's house is white supremacy in this state. You can't dismantle the master's house using the master's tools. Mm-hmm. Then Yvonne Rainer says you can if you expose the tools. When I say, what new tool do you suggest? It's really, Jacob, I'm asking you, what tool do you gravitate towards? Whether you want to apply the word new is up to you. You put the questions in the context you want. And if you, all these cute quotes I open the questions with, you don't have to apply them. You can just say the tool I gravitate towards is.
Yeah, so it's interesting because like I think it's a really thoughtful question. I think her quote is actually a really thoughtful one. I mean I have, even though I'm very far from a Marxist, I have sympathy for thoughtful Marxists like Benjamin.
Yeah.
But the I guess I would say like the tool would be the sacraments. I think for someone to actually return to a real, or for a society to return to a real spiritual life, which is almost impossible because the problem is that we would get a theocracy like we have in Iran or somewhere, right? Because the nastiest people often take power unless we have an actual parousia, right? And God rules us, which will come one day. But we like until then, the nastiest neocons are going to be the ones that are imposing some kind of like theocratic rule. But I would just say like for an individual, right, or for a society not compelled by the government, I think that what we need culturally is like a return to like the great spiritual verities. To dismiss.
That's hold it there, Jacob, because that was well put. The sacraments. Now you're pretty well versed in Walter Benjamin from your videos. You made two that were really good, I thought. So I
Oh,
figured you.
thanks.
And so, what would Walter say? What tool would he gravitate toward? What was his main tool?
So I my problem with Benjamin is even at the beginning of, which is one of my favorite texts of all time, that thesis on the philosophy of history. He talks about religion being used in the service of the revolution, right? And I think that there's something like truly poisonous about the thought of Marx. And I think it's interesting because I feel like Benjamin in that text is wrestling with God in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And it's like that text is like a prayer and it's like a plea for hope.
Yeah.
It's the most hopeful suicide letter ever written.
Wow.
And so
And he did commit suicide. At what age?
I don't know, in his 40s, I think late
Yeah.
40s. Maybe I'm
And
wrong.
what new toy do you suggest? This
Um,
is the flip because I kept asking people what new tool, and one person says, "Well, what about a toy?" So then I've added this to my script. What new toy do you suggest?
so what I would say the old toy, right? And not really a toy, but what I would say is I think like I think people like a rosary. I mean, I know that sounds corny, but it's
Yeah,
like
that's no, you that's amazing that you would even put rosary as a toy. I mean, dude, I'm a dumpster diver and I dumpster dive rosaries. I've got three of them hanging right over
oh wow,
there. I
wait,
don't say rosaries, but I like the iconography. Also, I was raised a Roman Catholic and I'm unusual because I checked out and I think religion has a couple great services. One is it teaches you community. It teaches you singing together. It teaches you looking at art through stained glass windows and
yeah.
iconography. So blah blah blah. Most, you know what? I'm going to ask you a question coming up, so I won't go there yet. Let's continue on. What do you worry about when you go to bed at night?
Having to wake up and go pee. That's always a bummer. It
That
happens a lot.
that is, dude. That is the. Well, you're not even there. I mean, how old are you?
It's a
Wait,
bummer,
how
isn't it?
old are you?
I'm 37, but
Age 37, dude. I'm 70. That's all you do. That's what the joke is. There's two jokes there. One is I've got to when you're our age, you got to pee when you're peeing.
yeah,
And then the other one is you go to the doctor and you go, "Doctor, I'm having trouble peeing." He goes, "How old are you?" He says, 80. He goes, "You peed enough."
yeah, yeah,
Okay, let's move on because here's McLuhan. He learned from Ezra Pound, the poet, that artists are the antenna of the race. They're broadcasting and
yeah.
detecting the hidden psychic effects of our inventions. So we might learn how to cope with what we don't like about our inventions. So, Jacob, I asked you the question Marshall probed his whole career. Why do we ignore the hidden psychic effects of our inventions, even though the artists are broadcasting them to us?
So I would encourage your viewers to check out a documentary I made on Rumble. It got kicked off of YouTube, but it's called "Funny How the World Ends." I think
Yeah.
the title is like, "Did CERN build a gateway to hell or something on Rumble just for audiences to be able to find it easier?"
Yeah.
And I can drop you the link if you want to put it in the description or something. But
No,
I
yeah,
mean,
here's what I suggest, Jacob. When we're done, this
uh-huh.
goes up on YouTube forever. Then you comment and go, here's the link to my video. Funny how the world
So
ends.
the problem is actually, and I would almost say don't even put a link in, because YouTube might ding you for it.
Okay, don't. Then they
Yeah.
know, they go to Rumble and look up funny how the world
Yeah,
ends.
or yeah, just look up the last sitcom, and the video is called something like "Did CERN open a portal to hell?" But just look at
Oh,
the
you
last
mean
sitcom.
on your website, which we do list, you can see it through that.
Yeah, that might still be the YouTube link, but maybe not. Yeah,
Okay.
I hope so, because it
Anyway,
got deleted.
go
But
ahead. What's the point you're trying to make? Funny
right.
how the
So
world
the point I'm trying to make is McLuhan actually, I think, answers that question. And I love that quote about Pound. Pound was a really early influence for me.
Yeah.
Actually, he was one of the, as a writer, the modernists are my biggest influence.
Yeah.
And when I was in college, like, Pound was one of the people that inspired me to study religion, and that inspired me not just to go to film school, like to really dig into
Yeah.
culture. And it's interesting because Pound was very punk rock in the true sense, but he was also like a Nazi. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
actually, but to be fair, the fascists. So I have problems with the punk ideology in many ways, but the fascism was not at all like a regressive philosophy. If you look at Mussolini, or if you look at that the futurist movement initially, right? Like, they were the exact opposite,
I
right?
love the futurists, and Pound's an important character. And Marshall used to go visit him in the mental hospital.
Oh,
The
really?
U.S. government threw Pound in a mental hospital, and Marshall used to go visit him. And then don't get us started, because we will get into Wyndham Lewis a little. But what is
The point,
yeah?
yeah,
Why you're saying Marshall answered it?
he
Why do
calls it
we humans?
narcissus narcosis.
Okay, that's yeah.
Right. So this idea that, like, we look at, so like every work of art is or every medium is an extension of ourselves, right? So like television being an extension of the visual medium, and what it does is it extends this one while
Yeah.
sort of anesthetizing the others, and it hypnotizes us, right?
Yeah.
And so as the motor of history moving forward, like, in part, right, media is like, the evolution of media is a major factor in that, and
Yeah.
and so what we're doing, what's happening for us is this inevitable hypnosis, because otherwise it would be agonizing, right? The
Yeah.
process itself would be agonizing, and again, it's like we're suffering beings, right? We're not thinking beings or feeling beings or are creating beings. What we are is we're suffering beings. Sorry to break it to you.
Yeah,
Everybody will
it's like, this is fun because, Jacob, I've asked this question for 40 years. Why do we ignore the hidden psychic effects? And you're like reading back to me what should be said is read Narcissus as narcosis. That's an amazing observation. It's hard to get McLuhan, and you've proven you've done your homework pretty well. And I appreciate that,
He
because
haunts me.
yeah, there's a flip there that I learned from Carolyn Casey, who I hope you'll look up. Compassionate Coyote Network News, Compassionate Trickster, and she talks about biomimicry. So I think it's the flip. When we invent something like a pencil, we're extending our fingers, say, or like Marshall said, when we invented film, we extended our foot because you could
Mhm.
travel. But then that's there's nothing more. Marshall said there's nothing more human than technology. That is extending humanness. But there's also this thing where we mimic nature. So Narcissus' narcosis is the legend goes, he looks in the water
Mhm.
and see the guy sees the image of himself and falls in love with the image of himself. No, he didn't. He fell in love with mirror.
Yeah.
And we invented the mirror because we couldn't carry around a pond of water or a river in our hands. So we biomimicked
Yeah.
nature by inventing a mirror. So that was good. Let's go on. Do artists have moral obligation?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I think so. And I think, but I almost can I ask you to come back to me in 5 years on that question? Because
Dude, I know at this point that we're on number 8, and I will be asking in the next 30 minutes if we could do part 2 in about 4 or 5 months. So we can keep this dialogue going. It's very
can I save that one for the
it's very enlightening for me. So go ahead, Jacob. Yes,
um so are you familiar? So there's a Baudrillard. You know Baudrillard?
yeah,
Yeah. So and he's kind of like a pocket McLuhan, right? And he has this idea of the hyper real, right?
yeah,
And it's interesting that you mentioned the Trump trial, right? Because like to me, and we may feel just differently about this, and agree to disagree, but it's not like I'm a huge Trump guy or anything necessarily. But to me, it's interesting that it's like Noam Chomsky said, if the Nuremberg trials were held today, every post-war president would hang. I'm sure you know that saying, right? And it's interesting that the first president ever that got convicted for something that I think was purely political, right? And so the court system itself has become hyper real, right?
yeah,
Like what's the media itself drives reality, not the other way around, right? Like he talked about like there's this famous moment where supposedly they asked. I'm probably going to get the exact circumstance here
yeah,
wrong, but like they asked Baudrillard to cover the Gulf War, and he said,
yeah.
I'll be glad to cover the Gulf War, but I'm not going to go to Iraq because it's not happening in Iraq. It's happening on television.
On
Um,
TV. Yeah, that's
yeah, and it's interesting, right? Like the war in Ukraine is not happening in Ukraine. It's happening on television, right?
yeah,
Because the reason that we're being funded, that it's being funded more, like the actual bodies on the ground, the actual people
yeah.
on the ground that are dying because of the influence of media, not the other way around. And
Yeah,
so
not
there's
not exclusively, but it metaphorically in all language and everything's metaphor. It's a great point. Yeah, I
um,
agree. I mean, we know that because we watched the Vietnam War bleed out of our TV sets. Did it cause the war to end? No. Did it galvanize a generation to kind of find a collective consciousness of let's seek peace? Yes, but there's a lot. It's like Joni Mitchell saying we were all hippies, then we became yippies, and now we're yuppies. So these are just and then I mean she's important and a great lyricist. So that was moral obligation. Now, are you more afraid of new ideas or more afraid of old ideas?
I don't know any like really new ideas except for it's funny, right? Because I feel like so many for example, like The Matrix, which is a beautiful movie, right? And it's like it felt like something truly new. The Matrix is really just Gnosticism. Do you know what I mean? And so often it's like the ideas that we're talking about actually have like a really ancient pedigree. Except for the one writer that I think really I wrestle with so much is McLuhan, right? And Baudrillard I think is similar in that way. Um,
You wrestle with that's the best thing you could be doing is wrestling. Don't ever think you'll get McLuhan,
no,
and it's really hard, but there are a lot of people and there's many books written about McLuhan, and it's really beautiful what you're coming up with here in this dialogue. I appreciate it. Jacob, here's the thing about the Matrix, two things. I was putting on events in the oldest political bookstore in the world when the Matrix came out, and who's the star of the Matrix?
Keanu Reeves.
He comes in our bookstore and buys every McLuhan book.
Wow. Okay, there you
And
go.
those two brothers who are now
Yeah,
sisters,
yeah.
they were reading Baudrillard and Baudelaire and McLuhan big time. And
Oh,
so the other one is one of my favorite T-shirts I ever saw on the street was "The Matrix is a documentary."
so I would argue that it's I think Gnosticism is actually ultimately, as you probably saw from my Abraxas video, right, or my Jung video, I have big problems with Gnosticism,
Yeah,
but it's interesting because I I am sure you know this. McLuhan was apparently a rather devout Catholic. Like he
he
was.
was he convert. You'll love this one because my main teacher, you got to delve into Bob Dobbs, and read some of him. He said Marshall converted to Catholicism as a performance art piece.
Really? Well, I mean,
That
he
is
had
a
6
great. Now,
kids.
whether that's true or not, I asked Eric McLuhan. I've had several encounters with Eric and many with Andrew. And I asked Eric that live in a church in LA once. And I says, I heard that your dad converted the Catholicism and performance art piece, and he goes, "Well, that's what Bob Dobbs says." He didn't say that's accurate, but what to me information is all about, and what you're doing is not spewing back all this stuff you've learned. You're it's going through your critical thinking skills, and you're coming up with Marshall's main goal: new questions and new metaphors. You don't just settle. So that's Marshall. Yeah, you don't meet him in the light. Did you ever see that book? I mean, that's all of after Marshall died, they put all his writings on Catholicism and religion in one book. It's pretty good. I mean, it's worth getting since that's two topics you're interested
Yeah,
in.
I'd be really. I mean,
So
because it
just
does
go
seem like
on.
he was quite serious about it from other things that I've heard. But so you think it might have been entirely performative?
Well, that's what one person said. I'm not saying anything's entirely anything. I think
Yeah.
that why did he convert to Catholicism? I've interviewed Leo Riley, who's a priest.
Mhm.
Go watch my interview with him, who knew Marshall. And he's sitting there in his 90s now, kind of still chuckling. And ask him. I mean, we could ask him. I mean,
Would
I'm
you?
sure.
Yeah, I would love to see if you could like send me. I
Just
just
go
don't want to forget. You know, like while I'm in the middle of the interview,
Leo Riley. Yeah, just look up
I would love
alien.
to see that interview. I'd be very
No,
interested.
and you don't even have to see my interview. Just Google Leo Riley and McLuhan. I mean, there's a lot of people who come out of Catholicism and religion who study McLuhan, and it's deep. I don't know. I mean, I think Marshall was basically upsetting the apple cart. So he was, I'd say, the most important thing I've ever heard Marshall's description was, it's either Frank Zagroni or Donald Thiel. I think it's Donald Thiel said Marshall teased people to believe his percepts were concepts.
Mhm.
So he's in a conceptual world, academia.
Yeah,
You're supposed to be called on Wikipedia a media theorist. Now that's what it says Marshall is.
yeah,
He's not a media theorist, but he would probably go, no, leave it. That's what they want to label me, and I'll go along with that. But I'm teasing people to believe, because he said I don't have theories, but I'm in the academic world where it's all built on theories. So they'll go, oh, that's his theory. Well, no, it isn't. That's his guess or his hunch. But
yeah.
there are things he feels. That's why his major thing is the tetrad. It's 4 questions. It's not, this is what a
Mhm.
car enhances. This is what a car renders obsolete. This is what a car retrieves, and this is what a car flips into when pressed to an extreme. It's not, there's no right or wrong answers, but you can go to all his tetrad books and he has his guesses for the answers.
Yeah.
So, this is next question. Let's go. Jacob, can you conjure up your earliest memory ever or one of them?
Okay, okay. So it's interesting, right? Because something that I've noticed about memory in general is that I had I had an ex-girlfriend who would do this where, and I think she might have done it just to provoke me. She was a brilliant person, but sometimes she would like misremember things like in a way that she knew that I would argue about, like where that was
Yeah.
obviously misremembered. But I also noticed myself doing that. Like it made me start to doubt my own memory at times a lot.
Yeah.
And so I do, like in terms of chronology, right? It's funny that people so adamantly believe the story that they remember. Um,
Yeah.
and so I'm skeptical about that. But what I identify as my earliest memory is like I was like about 2, I would think, and I'm like standing in my house in outside of Tulsa. I didn't own it, believe it or not. I was not, like I wasn't a homeowner too, but it was my parents' house. And my mom was there. I remember like seeing her in like the laundry room or whatever, and like snow falling outside, and like being struck by that impression. But
Yeah.
um,
Is memory more a curse or more a blessing?
I would say a blessing.
Yeah.
I ask anybody with dementia, right, or like anybody with really bad memory problems. I would say that in order for us to again, like make sense out of the world and to function in the world, we of course need it, for
Tell
us to
me,
use language.
tell me someone within your immediate family, then outside your immediate family, just briefly, who had an impact on you, kind of like a role model. And what specifically was that impact?
Oh, I mean, I think my parents, for sure, right? I think they were like,
What'd you majorly get from your mom and what'd you majorly get from your dad?
you know what? I think from both of them, I got what I would say is, so I think for a lot of people, like especially successful people, and my parents are really quite successful for in their chosen field, but I think for a lot of successful people, um, that I met sometimes values like integrity, right, and honesty, and those things like they're buzzwords that are used to control others, and they're things that they don't actually believe, right? That a lot of people don't actually believe these things. That it's just like bullshit for them.
Yeah.
And I think my parents taught me that those things are real and worth working for. And I've always like I think
That honesty and integrity are real and they're worth working for.
yeah, yes, and that like that these are real things. That this is not something that just a demagogue uses. Like do you ever like all the outtakes of politician videos, right, where they're like
Yeah.
petting their dog or whatever, and then they'll throw something at their assistant, etc. Like there are really people like that who try to live upright lives. Of all across the political and cultural spectrum, there are really people that are good people, and that's something that, especially as a writer, like if you ever read my fiction, like it does tend to be somewhat, misanthropic, and it's like that's something that I've always had to contend with, because I do believe that that's the world worth trying to inhabit.
That
Like
is great. So what were their careers again? What you said
uh,
there's
they're both attorneys, which is hilarious.
yeah,
So
okay.
that,
So
that should tell you.
now the same question outside your immediate family, just briefly. Someone who had an impact on you, and what was that impact?
Um, Oh, I have a number of friends. Well, here, let me think. Um, I'm trying to think of a really good example. Um, I don't know. This is, not like growing up necessarily, but like there's a deacon I met a while back who is sort of the same way, where he seems to go out of his way to make the world better. Which
That's
again is like, I don't know if it's just like a dispositional thing, but like the fact that there are people like that. And then I met a number of people who are, like really great artists that I met, who have taught me that like, holding your work to a high standard is really important,
good.
like, um, and, yeah, this is why some of my crappy sound on my earlier videos is kind of a bummer. I deleted a ton of videos because YouTube wouldn't monetize my channel initially. So some of the old ones are on Rumble, but I'll probably there are like 30 videos that got deleted.
Wow.
From
So did your parents raise you a particular religion?
I was raised like very evangelical, but I left Christianity forever. Like I became really involved in. Do you know who like Gurdjieff is? Have you ever heard of?
Sure.
Yeah,
Sure.
yeah, I was involved in Gurdjieff for many years, but I definitely am not a fan of Gurdjieff anymore. But there were nice
Okay.
people there. I don't want to speak ill of
Yeah.
anyone. They're
Yeah.
lovely
Uh,
people.
we bring up Gurdjieff in a question later on, but do you
Really?
do you pray?
Yeah, sure. I went
And
to mass this morning. I'm a terrible Catholic, but I do my best.
now, if God does exist, what would you like God to say to you after you die?
Well done, thou good and faithful servant.
Yeah. Do evil people exist, or does evil use people as a vehicle?
Evil is an absence of good, as Pseudo Dionysus says. Because all things, in order to partake in being, being itself is good because being is authored by God. God is outside of being, according to Pseudo Dionysus, right? So, like Pseudo Dionysus, who's a theologian, he doesn't have anything to do with like the Greek god Dionysus. We can get into, if people don't know, we can get into like the specifically like who this character is, but he's a theologian named Pseudo Dionysus, and our named you who said he was the writings of Dionysus the Areopagite, who's this figure in Acts, like a very early Christian, but it's pretty clearly not that guy. So this person is like writing under that name, but his theology is like really profound and like really formative for like a lot of Christian theology. But Pseudo Dionysus has this idea that basically like it's actually incorrect to think of God as existing, right? Because God is outside of being. God is the author of being, as of any other like formal quality, right? Of love or of time, right? So it's like God, you can't think of God in time because God is without time, right? God is without being, right? If God creates being, then he is not, there's nothing upon which his existence is contingent, right?
Yeah.
And so what was the answer? What was your question? I'm
No,
sorry.
that was really good. I said you answered the question was, do evil people exist, or does evil use
Oh yeah,
people?
can I just to complete that thought? Then
Sure.
so like even Satan, right? Like or anything that's evil, like insofar as it partakes in goodness. But
Yeah.
what all evil tries to do is to turn one away from reality. And which is interesting because like so much like evil and madness are so closely connected, especially in horror, right? Like I'm a horror writer, right? And like Lovecraft, like when you see the evil, you go mad, and like you're turned in on yourself and you're turned away from any sort of understanding of the real.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I mean, I hope that answers your question. I think
That
I've
answers
misread
it well.
Lovecraft a bit.
And it's actually, there's a hidden question. It's, Jacob, how do you advise someone to deal with an enemy? And I'll set it up. Alan Watts says, if you acknowledge your enemy, you empower them. Coppola stole from the mob and the samurai. Keep your friends close and your enemies closer.
Mhm.
JFK said, forgive your enemy, but don't forget their name. And Fellini says, I need an enemy. So it's a lot of thoughts. The basic question is, how do you advise someone to deal with an enemy? But first, how would you respond to Alan Watts? If you acknowledge your enemy, you empower him.
I think the only advice I can give, and it's one that I don't follow that well. I try, but I mean, God says that to love your enemies and to pray for those who persecute you. And I think as much as we can work toward that, I think it's great. But also, love is willing the good of the other as other. Aquinas says, right? Like so it doesn't mean like if someone hurts you in some way to empower them necessarily to be able to do it again, unless empowering them to do so would actually help them towards sanctification, which is ultimately something God has to decide, right? But there's like, when Saint Stephen was going to be stoned, right? Like as he was being stoned, he prayed for the forgiveness of the people that were stoning him. And if Christ and Saint Stephen are that model, it's like I can make up a lot of excuses. I can hold grudges, which I do. I can be contentious and crusty. I'm an artist. I have an ego the size of Texas, like any artist. But I think that all that shows me is how far away I am from the correct way to address an enemy.
Here's the follow-up. Nassim Taleb.
Mm-hmm.
Games were created to give the illusion. No, excuse me. Games were created to give non-heroes the illusion of winning. In real life, we don't know who wins or loses, but we can tell who a hero is. Villains don't think they're bad. They want control. Heroes want freedom. Gregory Bateson said, when the criminal gets caught, does he go, whoa, my criminal skills weren't up to snuff that day? Or does he go, oh, I did something morally and socially wrong? So again, it's a lot of prompts. You can go wherever you want, but the basic question is, does punishment work?
I mean, my biggest question there is, first of all, can we really tell who's a hero, right? Like at the end of the Republic, which I haven't read all the Republic, but I've read some of the highlights. And doesn't Odysseus go up there and they talk about how basically um, in the afterlife he realized like a lot of what he did was wrong, and I think a lot of those heroes are the same way, where like, is Ajax like a great person? I don't think so. Is Agamemnon? Most certainly not. And so I would argue the same way, like who's a hero, right? Like, to a lot of people, Che Guevara is a hero, and to
Yeah.
me he's like a murdering asshole, right? But like a lot of people, people put him on t-shirts, which is the ultimate punishment, by the way, for an anti-capitalist revolutionary, is that literally your image is being exploited for the profit of capitalists. So that's like an especially, like, I almost want to buy a Che t-shirt specifically for the irony. But it's really funny. It just occurred to me. But yeah, I mean, like, even this idea of like who is the hero, like the media determines who a hero is, because I think so often most people aren't particularly concerned with real values. I think that the observation that's been commonly made recently, at least, that if we were all in the middle of the Third Reich, this idea that we would all be fighting the Nazis has been shown to be wrong. In the recent pandemic, probably. Yeah, I don't want to get too political, but it's like I think there's some people, the people that say, let's go 20 years back, post 9/11, right? The people that were very much for the Patriot Act, which, like, those sorts of people, I think we all know what side they would have been on in the 40s, right? Or what side they would have been on during the Civil War, right? So many of the restrictions that have occurred in the last few years are direct outgrowths of the Patriot Act, are done by the exact same people, right? This idea of like what a hero is, to me, like a hero, everything is up to is we're all under judgment, and I don't think that the judgment of men should be particularly interesting to someone that's actually concerned with the good. I wish if I could share my screen. Can I show you this one thing?
Don't share your screen, but just explain it to us in words.
So there's a Catholic prayer called the Litany of Humility. Have you ever heard this?
Yeah. No, go ahead, tell me.
It begins like, Lord Jesus, meek and humble of heart, hear me. From the desire of being esteemed, deliver me, Jesus. From the desire of being loved, from the desire of being honored, from the desire of being extolled, from the desire of being praised, from the desire of being preferred to others. And then it's like, from the fear of being humiliated, from the fear of being despised, from the fear of suffering rebukes, from the fear of being wronged, from the fear of being suspected, from the fear of being forgotten, right? And after each one of those, you say, deliver me, Jesus, right? And then at the end, it says, like, that others may be loved more than I. Jesus, grant me the grace to desire, that others may be esteemed more than I, that in the opinion of the world, others may increase and I may decrease, that others may be chosen and I set aside, that others may be praised and I unnoticed, right? And then the very last one is that others may become holier than I, providing that I may become as holy as I should. And then you say, Jesus, grant me the grace to desire it. So it's not saying, let this happen to me, right? But it's saying, let me desire this, so that my desire is not for my own aggrandizement in the eyes of others. That may or may not happen, right? But what's interesting to me about that prayer, right, is it completely, there's something very Buddhist about it, right? Like, I think Buddhism and Christianity, like the detachment goals ideas are the same, but they have a different goal. But it's, that prayer to me is so interesting because it says it essentially like tries to evoke a complete indifference to the opinion of the world, and it shows the worthlessness of the opinion of the world. There's at the end of Barry Lyndon, the Kubrick film. Do you remember that coda at the end?
What happens? Yeah,
the last words are something like, good or bad, rich or poor, they are all equal now.
Yeah.
Which I don't think that's necessarily true, but at least in our eyes, right, they are. Or I don't think that's true, but I think in our eyes they are, right? And so that's, it's like the Shelley poem Ozymandias, right? So it's like, to me, the heroes, I don't trust media. I don't like the media. I don't know. Yeah. I sound like a crazy person. I'm sorry.
No, it's all right. You evoke two things Marshall said all the time: suspended judgment.
Yeah.
And it's not having a point of view. And it's sort of like this: when you're with one or more people, you can say, oh, I love Facebook or I hate Facebook. No, what you want to do is you don't say I love Facebook or I love hate Facebook when you're with one or more people. You just suss out how it's shaping our behavior so you can learn to cope with it. When you're at home in your lonely teenage room, you can go, I hate Facebook. You want to hold that suspended judgment to practice in the setting with other humans. And that's Pascal, the mathematician philosopher, said in order to understand anything, you have to know this end of the spectrum and that end and everything in between. So it's pattern recognition leads to comprehensive awareness. It's getting the big picture. So here's the question, mainly, that James Joyce said he was applied Aquinas. And Marshall said, I'm applied Joyce.
Okay.
So, you could be called, I'm applied Walter or whatever, but it's an interesting little pattern. You say, I'm applied something. Joyce was the first projectionist in Dublin 100 years ago. He
Really?
basically checked out of Volta Cinema. He said, this is stupid. Why should I go inside a building and see a movie of a tree when I can go outside and see a real tree? Years later, Faulkner said sometimes the best fiction is more true than journalism. Why do we have to recreate things in order to get them? Why do we have to go to a theatrical play of people acting out life? Why don't we just live life?
So, okay, a couple things. First, I am astonished that Joyce would have said I'm applied Aquinas, and only because Joyce was hardly a Christian. His. I think Ulysses is a beautiful book, as is Portrait. I'm not familiar with Finnegan's Wake, and I don't know Dubliner as well. I've read a couple of the stories there, but I mean, he's a marvelous writer. But like of all the philosophers in the world, I would think that Joyce had. I need to read on that quote. That amazes me.
Well, no, here's the other thing you'll love. I made this one up. He refers to BVDs in Finnegan's Wake. They are men's underwear.
Mm,
And Joyce's three main guys, really, in a lot of ways, besides Aquinas and a couple others, is Bruno, Vico, and Dante.
mm.
BVD. So
Yeah.
I mean, he's really applied BVDs. He's applying his underwear and recycling it. But yeah, no, your thoughts on this? Why do we have to recreate things in order to get them?
I don't think it's an active. Yeah, it's interesting. I don't really see it as an active recreation, right? Like I see like cinema or literature. It's hard to explain because I don't have that much of a clear theory on art other than, to me, like my experience in art is that it's just like reading McLuhan or Baudrillard, or more profoundly reading someone like Paul. Is it completely colors and reshapes the way that I view the world, in a way that it gives me a greater capacity to it enriches my experience, my daily experience, and it enriches my way of navigating relationships with people. But also, yeah, I think that there's something deeply, I don't know, like you're in dialogue with the whole of Western civilization. You know what I mean? Like when you pick up Joyce or when you pick up Aquinas, or like there's this beautiful chain of artists that I think, like, the more you read, like once you've read enough to really get a lot of those references, once you know who John Battista Vico was, even if you're not
Yeah,
that familiar with his work,
yeah,
then that like it actually helps you. Yeah, this whole new world is open to you, and it's a very lonely one too, because it's like you try to meet women that like most people, that you try to date or whatever, like they're not that interested in that sort of thing. But that sort of thing is a really big deal to me, and it's the world that I want to inhabit. It's also it's funny, my third novel is called David the Sinner, and it's the best thing I've ever done. It's I spent 3 years writing it. I'm hoping to get it published at some point, but it's interesting because it opens with a quote from Bruno. The bond of bonds is love. It's in Latin, but it's interesting because Bruno is someone that I've been wanting to investigate, because I do feel like there's something pretty gross about him. But I think he's definitely a profound mind, and he's influential in the history of the West, certainly, and especially in our new empirical age. I think there's my documentary for viewers, Funny How the World Ends, sort of gets into this, how technology is actually an outgrowth of ritual, of like ceremonial magic. And that the two fulfill essentially the same function, and at times they're indistinguishable. And I think that's really clear in, for example, the work of Jack Parsons, if you're familiar with him at all.
Sure.
Yeah, yeah.
That's also you almost directly quoted Arthur C. Clarke. Any technology is a form of magic. Let's close out with a few more delves into art, and then we'll schedule part 2, because we got this could be a 6-part Netflix series indeed. It's really been fun, Jacob. Here's Mike Kelly. Your reaction. Art is making your problems other people's problems.
I think the way I defined my work, and so I can really only speak for myself. I can't speak for anyone else. But I see my work as a prayer by someone better than myself.
Wow.
And so like to me, art is a prayer. Most of my favorite artists are that way, you know. I even think I think Woody Allen's art can be seen as a prayer, or Scorsese's, most certainly. You know, Mean Streets is so clearly a prayer to me, or Bringing Out the Dead.
Totally, and it's amazing because Mike was raised. I'm pretty sure he's raised Roman Catholic, and it's funny because that is a prayer of someone better than yourself. So you're tapping. Well, let's do a couple more. This is poet Fanny Howe. The point of art is to show people that life is worth living by showing that it isn't.
That's interesting. I don't, because there is something in tragedy, right? Like that catharsis that the audience experiences sort of vicariously through the tragic hero, which is why I love horror so much. Because you are well read enough to know this, but most people see horror as a trashy genre, but horror is clearly just tragedy. Do you know what I mean? Like there's a different name on it now.
Yeah.
But Macbeth is a horror story. You know.
Yeah.
King Lear, Hamlet, Dr. Faustus, most certainly. Tamerlane, Marlowe's Tamerlane is a perfect horror story, you know? So to me, it's like there is this element of like how vicarious catharsis can achieve something. I think the term is sublimation. I may be wrong, like the Freudian term, where it's basically like the emotions or whatever's repressed is released, and someone is sort of liberated from them, at least for a moment. But then there are movies that actually do the opposite of that, and like actually cause pain to the viewer. There's a horror picture I saw recently called Tales That Witness Madness. Have you ever seen this?
I have not seen it. Yeah,
I'd recommend it. It's on Plex. It's free. But it's interesting because it's like one of those old anthology movies, like the Amicus anthologies. It's not Amicus, but it's got that guy that's in all of them. Not Christopher Lee, but his like best buddy. I can't remember his name, but so it's interesting because all of the stories are like really dark jokes, but you're laughing with the madness.
Yeah.
In a way that it's actually like you are taking part in the malice of the proceedings. And so it's like almost in a way like designed to make you mad. You know, like The King in Yellow, you know, that play, that fictional play. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I don't know that one. Yeah.
There's this really famous. Oh, sorry.
King of Yellow?
The King in Yellow. It's a series of 4 stories. I've only read a couple of them by this like turn of the century, last century writer. And it's about these people that encounter this play that if you read it, you go crazy.
Oh, wow.
And so it sort of Tales That Witness Madness sort of feels like that.
Yeah.
But so it's doing the opposite thing that like catharsis is supposed to.
Well, it's good, Jacob, because we can kind of close out with this, which could last a few minutes, is Melrose said art is to transfer destiny into awareness. So I like your thing. It's a prayer of of someone better than yourself. So it's almost like you're inhabited by a muse, whatever. This is, I'm going to piggyback it with Hollis Frampton, the great experimental filmmaker. He said, narrative is born among the animal necessities of the spirit because we're waiting to die. So Melrose saying to transfer destiny into awareness. Oh, we're waiting to die. The
Yeah.
question I have for you is, can you forget to die?
My answer is, "O death, where is thy victory? O grave, where is thy sting?" Right? The whole, it's interesting because there's the evangelical or Protestant view of Christianity is like Jesus freed us from our sins or whatever, and so we can be better. Which that's part of Christianity. But what Christ actually did in his death and resurrection, it's interesting because like the early Christians, like why they had the crucifix, is because the cross was the most humiliating symbol. Like the cross, the reason that the cross was used for criminals is that they would display the power of the might of the Roman Empire, right? So it's like they would display, this is what we do to criminals. Look at this loser on display, right? As a work of art, essentially, right? Like the cross is a kind of medium almost, right? Like of Roman power. And it's interesting because the Christians, right? Like, so this is the most powerful empire that the world has ever seen. Well, maybe not actually. Like maybe the Mongol Empire was more powerful, but at least in the West, right? The most powerful empire in the West, at least. And these people, essentially, this ideology took it over because when they put you in the Colosseum, what you're supposed to do is scream and cry and beg, and yet they would be praying, right? And they would be singing and they would be begging to go first, right? And then all the rich and powerful people would look and say, hey, here's a rich man, here's a poor man, and they're the same. They're all equal under God and they're unafraid of death. So the thing that the Roman Empire could threaten you with, the biggest thing was death and torture and pain, and they laughed at it, right? And what's interesting is their symbol was our king, like over the cross it says INRI, right, which is Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, which was mocking him, right? Like that's his fake throne with the crown of thorns, but it became his real throne. And so they used this symbol of humiliation as the symbol of ultimate victory to say you cannot do anything to us because our champion conquered all of it, came back, and then and we eat of his flesh, we drink of his blood, and we become assimilated to his body. So you can do nothing to us. Death, to quote Paul, is swallowed up in victory, right? Which is and I'm going to get this a little bit wrong. I don't remember the exact verse, but so like the ancient Roman emperors, like when they would have a victory, right, or the generals or whatever, they would take their enemies in procession, right, through the square, through the city or whatever, and everyone would be cheering. And Paul says Christ took like death and sin in procession, right? And in this like victory procession, right? And so that I think is what I would say about death. Is I would say that first quote, which is a beautiful one. I think it's very Greek, right? It's very pagan. This idea that I don't believe that death. I think for someone who believes, death takes on an entirely different meaning. And yeah, it's a scary thing, but I wait for the resurrection. As to quote Walter Benjamin, every moment is the narrow gate through which the Messiah might enter.
Wow. And if just to ask the question again, can you forget to die? What would you say?
I think even if you forget, it's going to happen, right? Unless we get the resurrection first.
That's not what I'm asking. Can you forget to die?
I don't know. Maybe.
Yeah. Yeah. Because see, here's the problem, Jacob. Most people don't know if I'm asking it literally or metaphorically.
Actually, wait, can I change my answer?
Sure.
I think that we should remember that we're going to die, right? Because the whole idea of memento mori, everyone's forgotten to die.
Yeah.
Right? Like in general, isn't that the default state of human beings?
Yeah. That's what it's rooted in. It goes in the Zizek and all these people in talking about this whole thing. and I'm glad you heard that, because I don't bring that one Malraux up much, is to transfer destiny into awareness. And what do you do with it? I mean, it's almost like some people think, well, I can forget to die, because everybody's, especially my age, where everybody's dying between 60 and 80, usually die then. And so it's on your mind. Well, if you forget, that doesn't mean, that could mean, well, I'm just going to live my life to the fullest. Or it could mean, oh, I've got to ponder it and make it an issue and die with dignity. Or, I'm going to freak out because I've got to face this change or whatever. Now, one friend told me that whatever happens to you after you die is whatever you believe happens to you. So, Krasner nailed it. He says, I only believe in reincarnation in one of my past lives. But, one thing you also touched on was really cool, was it's totally McLuhan, just to close out, is, well, the most watched TED Talk of all time is Fake It to Make It. And there's fact, the word fact, FACT, and the word fake, both derive from the Latin root to make. So that's Marshall's main thing, was making or matching, and it's to make. So it's like incredible time spent with you making, to me, new metaphors and new questions. That's what's important. We don't have to talk, and we know what we're certain about, though I felt I learned a lot from you in this 90 minutes, because it feels as though you're well versed in what you're talking about.
Well, thank you. It's been such a pleasure. I'm so glad that you reached out to me. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah. And again, I'll send you dates, and we'll book another one a couple months down the road. And thank you so much, Jacob. Even though I'm going to hit the end broadcast button, I hope this never ends and we can keep talking forever and ever.
Same here. I had a question for you. When you hit in
broadcast? No, go ahead.
Oh, can I ask you outside of the one?
Oh, yeah, we could do that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, here we go.